1978, when he came to power, they didn't call him chairman. They didn't call him premier. They didn't give him those titles. He was deputy premier. He was deputy chairman.
That was his highest rank.
That was his highest rank. And I think after Mao, they didn't want to give anybody all those titles for fear that he might again become a dictator and overrun everybody else in the party. And they weren't going to let him do that.
Deng Xiaoping, Redefining Communism in China. Communism as an ideology was made as a critique of the ills of capitalism and liberalism. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, its first proponents, advocated for the abolition of capitalism in exchange for an egalitarian society where everything is communal. This type of society was the aim of the communist revolutionaries in China. However, as we see the progression of communism in China, we see how, in reality, this ideology is quite difficult to implement. In this episode, we will talk of another prominent figure in China who redefined the communist ideology and upheld policies that somehow deviated from it. This figure was Deng Xiaoping, the most powerful leader after Mao Zedong. Deng Xiaoping was born in China's Guang'an in the Sichuan province of August 22, 1904, to a small landlord family. Being a particularly bright child, his parents had dreams for Deng becoming a government official and made sure that Deng was educationally equipped. Like any other privileged child in China, Deng began schooling at age 5 and started with Confucian texts. His wits and his father's support made him enter good schools, where his progressive teachers influenced his political views and instilled in him a sense of patriotism at a very young age. At age 14, he took part in the 1919 May 4th movement demonstrations, a movement in response to the Treaty of Versailles, which stated that the former German concession in the eastern part of Shandong would be ceded to Japan rather than being returned to China. The movement criticized the West's disregard for China's rights, as well as the weakness of China's government to stand up for the country's interests. Aside from the movement, anti-Japanese boycotts were paraded in Chongqing by the fall of the same year. A sense of nationalism engulfed the Chinese youth and an awareness of international developments. The Chinese political scene at the time greatly shaped Deng's identity, and since then, his goal was to free China from international humiliation and restore its former glory. When an opportunity came for Deng to study abroad, his father readily grabbed it. During the First World War, France had a shortage of laborers for their factories. The country recruited thousands of Chinese to cover the shortage and also offered some prominent Chinese students to both do diligent work and frugal study, both working part-time while also studying modern science and technology. France then became the go-to destination for Chinese students who sought to study abroad. A special relationship fund was established by a rich businessman from Sichuan that aimed to admit Sichuan students to the work-study program in France. Only a few were able to acquire scholarships. Apparently, Deng failed the French language examination, but his father managed to pay for his passage. By the time of 1920, the 16-year-old Deng then set out to France and was admitted to the Bayeux Middle School in Normandy. However, his arrival was ill-timed. In January 1921, only less than 3 months after his arrival, the Sichuan Special Scholarship Fund was set to be cut by March 15 that year due to the severe inflation in France. On March 13, along with his fellow worker students, Deng left Bayeux. He was able to land a job in Creusot at France's large ordnance factory, Schneider et Compagnie, 3 weeks later with a dream of earning enough to be able to study again. Deng soon found that despite most of the Chinese worker students coming from affluent families, the job they landed in France had humiliatingly poor conditions in chemical factories and mines with lower pay than ordinary French workers. It was under this context that Deng, along with fellow student workers, witnessed the bourgeois exploitation of workers, the poor treatment of Chinese workers, and the Chinese humiliation by European imperialists. Despite this, Deng and his fellow student workers took pride in Chinese civilization and realized that a vanguard of elites is needed to organize movements and change the situation. After jumping from one job to another and finding no opportunity to study again, Deng decided to dedicate himself to the radical cause and actively advocated for it. In 1921, the Chinese Communist Party was founded. Despite being in its infancy, its existence had a profound effect on the worker students in France. In 1923, Deng became one of the Chinese Communist Youth League working under its secretary, Zhou Enlai. Having proved himself to be reliable, Deng became the head of the party organization in Lyon in 1925. In November of that year, Deng was actively doing propaganda work to organize workers in Paris and openly oppose the oppressive Chinese government. The series of demonstrations by Chinese student leaders led them to be deported by the end of 1925. With the threat of arrest, Deng escaped to the Soviet Union in January 1926. After 2 weeks, he was admitted to the first class at Sun Yat-sen University, wherein members of the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party were trained alongside each other to become revolutionaries and restore China's dignity. Deng even studied alongside Chiang Kai-shek's son, Chiang Ching-kuo. At the time, the Soviet Union was under the national economic policy, wherein private businesses and independent farmers were encouraged to prosper while the socialist economy developed heavy industry. Foreign investments were also encouraged. Perhaps the setup made an impression on Deng that the structure wherein a mix of private enterprise and foreign investment under a communist leadership promoted fast economic growth at par with capitalist societies. This structure resembled his future policies within China. Upon returning to China at age 23, he became the chief secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party and was tasked to organize the people from the countryside. When tensions arose between the former allies, the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party, Deng actively took part in the communist struggle. He joined the 1934-35 Long March, along with its leader Mao Zedong and thousands of communist soldiers, and became one of its survivors. During the fight against the Japanese, Deng became a soldier and became one of the military leaders who successfully destroyed not only the Japanese, but later on the nationalist armies during the resumption of the Chinese Civil War. When the CCP came out victorious after the Civil War, and the People's Republic of China was established, Deng became the regional party leader of southwestern China and further rose in ranks. In 1952, he became the vice premier in Beijing, and in 1954 became the CCP's general secretary. Although he was deeply loyal to Mao, Deng started to oppose Mao when the latter advanced the Great Leap Forward policy. As we talked about in the previous episode, this initiative was a total disaster. He preferred the use of material incentives and the development of skilled workers in China over Mao's egalitarian policies. This opposition led him to be attacked in the 1966-67 Cultural Revolution and was stripped of his high political status in 1967. He briefly disappeared from the public eye afterward. Deng made a political comeback in 1973 under the sponsorship of Premier Zhou Enlai. He was reinstated as a deputy premier in 1973 and became the vice chairman of the Central Committee, a member of the Politburo, and chief of the General Staff in 1975. He was expected to succeed Zhou's position not until Zhou died in January 1976, wherein a pro-Mao radical elite called the Gang of Four kicked Deng out of leadership again. But when Mao died in September of the same year, the power of the Gang of Four went along with it. Deng returned to power in July 1977. Initially, Deng struggled for control over the party and government with Mao's successor, Hua Gufeng. However, his skills and broad support made Hua give up his position to Deng's apprentices in 1980. Zhao Ziyang became the premier of the government and Hu Yaobang as the general secretary of the party. Deng's political position made him become the chief policy maker of China in the 1980s. He sought to achieve economic development for the country through various reforms. Among these policies involved the well-known one-child policy to battle the population boom. He encouraged the individual responsibility of farmers over production, as well as the formation of skilled and educated technicians and managers. He relinquished government control over several industries and strengthened economic ties with the West by encouraging foreign investment. His policies indeed led to economic development in China and significantly improved living standards. Despite these seemingly liberal policies, however, Deng still very much upheld the one-party rule by the Communist Party and its authority, wherein the likes of Hu Yaobang advocated for a more democratic and liberal government. He was kicked out of his position in January 1987. When he died in April, this sparked up protests from the studentry and looked up to Hu as a martyr in the name of liberalization. On the day of Hu's funeral, thousands of demonstrators gathered in the Tiananmen Square. By May, the numbers multiplied by millions after the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev visited China. While the Chinese government was initially divided, with Zhao Ziyang, Hu's successor, advocating diplomatic means, Chinese Premier Li Peng wanted to forcibly suppress the protesters. This measure was supported by Deng. By June of that year, tanks and armed troops advanced in the square and quashed those who came in the way. To clear the area, the protesters were violently shot by the troops. Hundreds died and thousands were injured. The amount of violence in this event led the US to temporarily institute economic and diplomatic sanctions and the branding of the incident as a massacre, which led to international criticism. Although Deng's way of dealing with revolts was not as brutal as Mao's, it certainly contributed to the CCP's bad reputation in the international arena. Deng's leadership has also shown that the communist ideology in China, in actual practice, much like the case of the Soviet Union, deviates much from its original principles. As shown by Deng's China, the mixed economic model fared better than Mao's egalitarian model. Moreover, despite the goal of communism to have a classless society, the outcome of the revolution in China was the birth of a new kind of authoritarianism that's repressive and violent, just like its predecessors, although it only varies in degree. This was Deng's legacy. Now we know how communism slowly evolved within China, and in the following episodes, we'll learn more about it, the course of its developments and its consequences within the country, and its relations with the other states. Stay tuned and thank you for joining us today. If you enjoy this episode, subscribe and hit the bell icon to be notified of future episodes.